The radio went silent at 4:47 hours. Not the kind of silence that comes with interference or atmospheric disruption, but the absolute void that follows when men stop breathing. Somewhere in the Helmand Valley, 12 Marines had vanished from every tactical frequency, every satellite uplink, every desperate attempt to raise them on backup channels. The operations center at Camp Leatherneck felt the absence like a physical weight. Officers stood motionless around glowing screens that showed nothing but static coordinates and the last known position of Recon Team Viper. The team had been moving through a compound series in a region so remote that local elders claimed even the Taliban avoided it after dark. Their final transmission had been routine, almost boring in its professionalism. Then nothing. The kind of nothing that made seasoned operators check their equipment twice and junior analysts taste copper in their mouths. Captain First Class Elena Katsaros felt the silence differently than the others gathered in the Tactical Operations Center. She stood near the back wall, arms crossed, watching the scramble of personnel trying to reestablish contact. Her flight suit was faded in places where the sun had bleached it during countless sorties, and her boots carried the dust of 100 forward operating bases. Nobody looked at her during the initial panic. Nobody asked her opinion. She had learned over 9 years and 3 deployments that being the only A-10 pilot in a room full of faster jets and helicopter crews meant being functionally invisible until something went catastrophically wrong and needed someone willing to fly low enough to count bullet holes. She watched the clock, watched the map, watched the way the operations officer kept touching his earpiece as if physical contact might summon voices from the void. The A-10 Thunderbolt waiting on the flight line outside had her call sign painted beneath the canopy in letters someone had tried to scrub off twice. Hatchet. Not the kind of call sign pilots earned through glory or skill, but the type that stuck after you, made command uncomfortable. After you filed reports that asked inconvenient questions about fuel allocation and mission planning. After you flew damaged aircraft back to base when doctrine said to eject. The name had started as mockery, evolved into grudging acknowledgement, and settled into something nobody quite knew how to categorize. Elena preferred it to the alternatives. It was honest. When the satellite imagery finally updated, showing thermal signatures consistent with combat and then a spreading heat pattern that suggested fire, the room erupted in controlled chaos. Helicopters were too far. F-16s were too fast for the terrain. Someone mentioned waiting for dawn. Elena was already walking toward the door. The night air hit different at Leatherneck. Dry and cold, and carrying the smell of aviation fuel and distant burn pits. Elena's crew chief was already at the aircraft, running pre-flight checks with the kind of intensity that came from knowing Marines were dying while mechanics worked. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb had been her crew chief for 18 months, long enough to stop questioning her decisions and start anticipating them. He looked up as she approached, reading something in her stride that made him move faster. "They're not sending you," he said. "Statement, not question." "Not officially." Webb's hands never stopped moving across the aircraft's exterior, checking panels and weapons pylons with tactile memory. The A-10 looked predatory in the darkness, its nose painted with teeth that gleamed dull white under the flight line lights. 7 hardpoints carried a mixed loadout of rockets, missiles, and the 30mm cannon that made the aircraft's entire frame vibrate when it fired. Elena had requested the heavy configuration 3 days earlier, before anyone knew Recon Team Viper would need it. "Bird's clean," Webb said. "Full fuel, full ammunition, and I didn't see you leave." Elena ran her own pre-flight check, hands following familiar paths across cold metal and composite materials. Every pilot had their ritual. Hers involved touching specific points on the aircraft in sequence, a pattern that centered her thoughts and confirmed mechanical reality. The landing gear strut, the leading edge of the wing, the auxiliary power unit, physical contact with the machine that would carry her into whatever hell waited in the Helmand Valley. "How long until they notice?" she asked. "However long it takes someone to check the flight line roster." Webb handed her the helmet, custom-fitted and scarred from too many missions. Maybe 20 minutes if we're lucky. Alina climbed the boarding ladder with practiced efficiency, settling into the cockpit that had become more familiar than any room she'd ever rented. The instruments glowed to life as she powered systems online, each switch and button exactly where her fingers expected. The A-10 was ancient by modern standards, designed during the Cold War to kill Soviet tanks and survive the kind of damage that would tear faster aircraft apart. It was slow, ugly, and carried enough firepower to level buildings. Command preferred precision strikes from altitude. Alina preferred being close enough to see what she was shooting at. The engine start sequence filled the cockpit with sound and vibration. The tower would notice. Operations would notice. By then she'd be airborne and committed, flying toward coordinates that showed heat signatures and silence and 12 Marines who needed someone willing to ignore orders for their sake. Webb gave her a thumbs up from the tarmac, and Alina released the brakes. The takeoff roll felt longer in darkness, the runway lights streaming past like tracers, as the A-10 accelerated with its characteristic reluctance before committing to flight. Alina rotated at the calculated speed and felt the main gear leave concrete, then the nose gear, the aircraft climbing into night sky with steady determination. She switched frequencies away from the tower before anyone could order her to return, pointing the nose toward the last known coordinates of Recon Team Viper. The landscape below became invisible at altitude, just darkness and occasional lights from compounds and villages. Alina flew by instruments and memory, following a route she'd flown dozens of times in different configurations toward different emergencies. The A-10 systems hummed around her, reliable and familiar. She trained young pilots who treated the aircraft like a museum piece, something to tolerate before graduating to faster platforms. Alina had learned to love its limitations because they forced her to think differently, to fly closer and slower, and with more precision than jets designed for speed ever required. Her radio crackled with the expected response. Hatchet 1, this is Leatherneck Tower. You are not cleared for departure. Return to base immediately. Alina adjusted her heading 2 degrees east. Leatherneck Tower, Hatchet 1, radio malfunction. Cannot receive your transmission. Continuing mission. The silence that followed carried weight. They knew she was lying. She knew they knew. The dance of plausible deniability that would protect everyone involved if she succeeded and crucify her if she failed. Alina had made peace with that calculus years ago, the first time she'd watched Marines die because helicopters were grounded and fast movers couldn't get low enough to help. The terrain below began to rise as she approached the valley. Alina descended gradually, keeping the A-10 low enough to avoid most radar but high enough to maintain situational awareness. The night vision system painted the landscape in shades of green, showing ridgelines and compounds and the winding paths that served as roads in regions where the government existed only as rumor. She was 30 minutes from Recon Team Viper's last position, 30 minutes from whatever had made them stop talking. The first sign of trouble came as scattered radio traffic from other units in the region. Short, clipped transmissions suggesting enemy movement and possible contact. Alina listened to the pattern, building a tactical picture from fragments of information. The Taliban had learned to coordinate complex ambushes, using terrain and timing to isolate coalition forces before overwhelming them with numbers. If Recon Team Viper had walked into something like that, their silence made terrible sense. Alina armed her weapon systems methodically, each switch activation a commitment to violence that might be necessary in the next few minutes. The 30mm cannon loaded and ready, the Maverick missiles active on their rails, the Hydra rockets set for area suppression. She'd seen pilots hesitate at this moment, caught between training that emphasized restraint and reality that demanded overwhelming response. Alina had stopped hesitating after watching what happened when you arrived too late with too little firepower. The coordinates appeared on her navigation display, glowing markers showing the compound where Recon Team Viper should be. Alina began her approach from the south, staying low between ridgelines to mask her arrival. The element of surprise was the only advantage she'd have if the Marines were in contact and outnumbered. The A-10's speed worked in her favor for once, giving her more time to analyze terrain and identify threats before committing to a gun run. What she saw through the targeting system made her grip the stick harder. The compound was lit by fires, multiple structures burning with the intensity that suggested accelerant. Thermal imagery showed heat signatures clustered in defensive positions around the northern wall, and a much larger mass of heat signatures advancing from 3 directions. The Marines were still alive, still fighting, and completely surrounded by what looked like 50 or more enemy combatants. Alina keyed her radio to the emergency frequency that Recon Team Viper should be monitoring. Viper Actual, this is Hatchet 1. Angels 12 carrying full load. Give me targets and I'll clear your dance floor. For 3 seconds that felt like hours, only static answered. Then a voice emerged from the void, rough with exhaustion and controlled fear. Hatchet 1, Viper Actual. Christ, are you real? We've got 50+ hostiles in 3 groups, north, east, and west positions. They're preparing for final assault. We're down to magazines and grenades. Alina checked her fuel and weapon status. Enough for one sustained engagement if she was efficient, if she was perfect. Viper Actual, Hatchet 1, keep your heads down. I'm coming in hot from the south. Mark your position with IR strobe. The confirmation came immediately, and Alina saw the infrared strobe light appear on her targeting display, a tiny beacon marking where 12 men waited for salvation or death. She lined up her approach, angling for the northern group first because they had the best position and most cover. The A-10 descended into the valley like judgment, its titanium bathtub protecting her from ground fire and its weapons ready to turn the night into thunder. The first gun run was textbook. Alina identified the enemy position, adjusted for wind and altitude, and let the 30 cannon speak its brutal language. The sound was distinctive even through the cockpit insulation, a deep ripping noise like tearing metal at industrial scale. Depleted uranium rounds walked across the northern position at 70 rounds per second, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through light armor and turn flesh into mist. The tracers looked beautiful and terrible, a stream of fire that connected sky to earth with mathematical precision. She pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat as she climbed for another pass. The radio came alive with voices, Marines calling out results and directing her attention to secondary targets. Alina processed the information while checking her instruments and planning her next approach. The eastern group was moving, trying to flank toward the compound under cover of darkness. She rolled the A-10 into a bank that would have made her flight instructor proud, then dove toward the new target with rockets armed. The Hydra rockets left their rails in pairs, streaking toward the earth with trails of fire and smoke. Alina walked them across the enemy position with practiced timing, each explosion creating a bloom of heat and pressure that threw bodies and equipment into the air. She didn't celebrate, didn't feel satisfaction or disgust, just the cold focus that came from doing necessary work with maximum efficiency. More Marines alive at the end meant she'd calculated correctly. The Western group had learned from watching their comrades die. They'd scattered into better cover and were laying down suppressive fire toward both the compound and Alina's aircraft. She felt the rounds impact her wings and fuselage, sharp metallic sounds that confirmed the A-10's reputation for surviving damage. The titanium bathtub around the cockpit kept her safe, while she lined up another gun run, this time from a different angle to avoid giving them a predictable target. This pass was closer, lower, more aggressive than the previous runs. Alina could see muzzle flashes through her canopy as she approached, enemy fighters standing their ground and firing automatic weapons at an aircraft designed to fly through worse. The 30 cannon answered with its characteristic roar, chewing through their position with mathematical precision. When she pulled up this time, the Western group had stopped moving entirely. Viper Actual, Hatchet 1, 3 groups neutralized, status. The reply came faster now, energized by sudden hope. Hatchet 1, Viper actual. Compound secure. We've got 2 critical wounded and 1 urgent surgical. Can you get us extraction? Alina checked her fuel, checked her remaining ammunition, then checked the tactical display showing enemy forces still in the region. Getting 12 Marines and their wounded onto helicopters would require time and cover, neither of which existed in abundant supply. Viper actual, Hatchet 1. I'll make it happen. Sit tight. She climbed to altitude and switched frequencies, reaching out to the Tactical Operations Center that was probably still trying to decide how to court-martial her. Leatherneck Operations, Hatchet 1. I need immediate CASEVAC birds to the following coordinates. Recon Team Viper is secure but critically wounded. The area is hot, but I can provide cover. The response came from a different voice this time, someone senior who'd been dragged into the operations center when word spread that an A-10 pilot had gone rogue. Hatchet 1, this is Colonel Marks. Explain your current position and authority. Alina's laugh was brief and bitter. Sir, with respect, 12 Marines don't care about my authority. They care about bleeding out in Helmand Province. Send the helicopters or explain at the memorial service. The silence stretched long enough that Alina thought she'd finally crossed a line too far. Then Colonel Mark's voice returned, different tone, different weight. CASEVAC inbound your position. 20 minutes. Keep them alive, Captain. Yes, sir. 20 minutes felt like a different unit of measurement at altitude while wounded men bled below. Alina maintained her orbit above the compound, weapons ready, eyes scanning for any movement that might signal another attack. The Taliban weren't stupid. They'd learned that American air power created opportunities as often as it closed them, that pilots had to return to base eventually, that patience and darkness were weapons of their own. The movement came from the north again, different group or survivors from the first assault. Thermal imaging showed a dozen heat signatures advancing in a formation that suggested training and experience. Alina descended immediately, putting herself between the advancing enemy and the compound. They saw her coming and went to ground, making themselves harder targets. She switched to missiles, reserving her remaining cannon ammunition for close-range emergencies. The Maverick missile launched with a solid thump, rocket motor igniting and accelerating the weapon toward its programmed target. Alina watched it track, guided by infrared signature, until it impacted in a bloom of fire and pressure that scattered the enemy formation. The survivors retreated rapidly, dragging wounded and disappearing into terrain that swallowed men like water. Alina let them go. Her mission was protecting the Marines, not body count. The helicopters arrived exactly 20 minutes later, 2 CH-53s escorted by Apache gunships that took over the security role, while the larger aircraft descended into the compound. Alina coordinated with the Apache pilots, sharing intelligence and remaining on station until she watched the last Marine load into the helicopters and lift off toward safety. Only then did she turn toward Leatherneck, fuel gauge showing numbers that would make the flight back interesting. The landing was routine until she rolled to a stop on the flight line and saw the reception committee waiting, base security, operations officers, and Colonel Marks himself, standing with arms crossed and an expression that promised consequences. Alina shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then she climbed down to face whatever came next. Webb was there first, handing her a bottle of water and speaking quietly. All 12 Marines made it, 2 in surgery stable condition. The others are already calling you a hero. Alina drank half the water before responding. Heroes follow orders. I just flew an airplane. Colonel Marks approached with the deliberate pace of someone who decided something important and wanted everyone to know it. He stopped 3 feet away, studying her with eyes that had seen too many wars and too many funerals. Captain Katsaros, you stole an aircraft, violated airspace restrictions, engaged enemy forces without authorization, and risked an international incident. Alina met his gaze without flinching. Yes, sir. You also saved 12 Marines who would be dead if you'd followed procedure. Mark's expression didn't change. Operations has reviewed your gun camera footage and radio traffic. Mission effective, minimal collateral damage, textbook close air support under impossible circumstances. Thank you, sir. I'm not finished. Mark stepped closer. You're grounded pending formal review, your aircraft is impounded, and you're confined to base until we decide whether to give you a medal or a court-martial. Elena nodded slowly. She'd expected worse. Understood, sir. Marks turned to leave, then paused and looked back. The Marines you saved asked me to tell you something. They said Hatchet finally makes sense now. Said you came back for them like death itself, dragging broken wings and fury. He walked away before Elena could respond, leaving her standing on the flight line with her crew chief and the scarred A-10 that had carried her into hell and back. Webb checked the aircraft damage, running his hands over bullet holes and scorched panels with professional assessment. The left wing showed structural damage that would require depot-level maintenance, and the vertical stabilizer had taken rounds that somehow missed critical systems. She's hurt bad, Webb said quietly, but she flew you home anyway. Elena touched the fuselage, feeling the metal still warm from flight. She always does. The next 3 days existed in bureaucratic limbo. Elena was confined to her quarters except for meals and mandatory interviews with officers who asked the same questions in different configurations. She answered honestly, showed no remorse, and refused to play political games about following orders versus saving lives. Some officers seemed angry. Others seemed impressed. Most seemed uncertain how to categorize a pilot who'd violated regulations so thoroughly while executing a mission so effectively. The Marines told a different story to anyone who'd listen. They described the silence after their radios died, the growing certainty that help wouldn't arrive in time, and the sound of an A-10's cannon tearing through the night like divine intervention. They'd learned Hatchet's real name and started calling her Captain Katsaros with a reverence usually reserved for legendary figures. The base couldn't decide whether she was a hero or a criminal, so it settled for watching her closely and waiting for someone senior enough to make the call. On the 4th day, Elena was summoned to the base commander's office. General Patterson commanded all aviation operations in the region, a career officer who'd flown fighters in Desert Storm and maintained opinions about the A-10 that leaned toward obsolescence and budget waste. Elena entered his office expecting the court-martial conversation to begin. Instead, she found Colonel Marks, 2 Marines in dress uniforms, and a full investigation file that someone had assembled with thorough attention to detail. General Patterson gestured to a chair and Elena sat, maintaining the professional neutrality that had served her through 3 deployments. The Marines were sergeants from Recon Team Viper, and they watched her with expressions that mixed gratitude with uncertainty about why they'd been summoned. Captain Katsaros, General Patterson began, voice carrying the weight of command decisions. I've reviewed every aspect of your unauthorized mission, the tactical analysis, the gun camera footage, the radio transcripts, and I've read statements from 12 Marines who credit you with their survival. Elena remained silent. Anything she said now would either help or hurt, and she couldn't predict which until Patterson revealed his decision. Your actions violated regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral decision-making. You commandeered an aircraft worth $30 million, engaged enemy forces without authorization, and risked creating an international incident if you'd been shot down. Patterson paused, letting the words settle. You also demonstrated extraordinary airmanship, tactical judgment, and dedication to the mission that defines military aviation at its best. The silence stretched. Elena could hear air conditioning and distant voices from outside the office. She kept her hands still and her expression neutral. Sergeant Martinez and Sergeant Chen have requested permission to speak, Patterson continued, nodding toward the Marines. I'm granting that permission now. Martinez stood first, a compact man with a face that showed his indigenous heritage and eyes that had seen combat too young. "Sir, permission to speak freely." "Granted." "Captain Quetzaro saved my life and the lives of my team. We were minutes from being overrun when she arrived. Maybe seconds. The enemy had us surrounded, and we'd already written our last letters home." Martinez's voice carried steady conviction. "I don't care about regulations or procedures or politics. I care that 12 Marines got to call their families and tell them we're alive. That happened because Captain Quetzaros flew toward the sound of guns when everyone else was calculating risk." Chen stood next, taller and younger but carrying the same intensity. "Sir, I've served with the best combat pilots in the Marine Corps. Harriers, Hornets, Cobras, all of them good at what they do. But Captain Quetzaros flew an A-10 into a valley at night with 50 Taliban fighters trying to kill us and didn't miss once. Didn't hit our position. Didn't waste ammunition. She fought like someone who'd rather die than let Marines down." Patterson listened without interruption, then turned to Alina. "Captain, do you have anything to add?" Alina considered her words carefully. "Sir, I knew the risks and made my choice. If the outcome had been different, the responsibility would rest entirely with me. But it wasn't different. 12 Marines are alive. That justifies any consequences that result from my actions." Patterson nodded slowly, then opened the investigation file and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "The review board has made its recommendation. Based on the totality of circumstances, including the successful rescue and your exceptional performance under extreme conditions, you are hereby cleared of unauthorized action charges. Instead, you're being recognized for valor and extraordinary airmanship." Alina felt something shift in her chest, relief mixing with disbelief. "Sir." "Don't misunderstand, Captain. You still violated regulations, and you're receiving a formal letter of counseling. But you're also receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions that night." Patterson's expression remained stern. "Command needs pilots who follow orders, but we also need pilots willing to make hard choices when the situation demands it. You demonstrated both that night, even if the sequence was unconventional." The meeting ended with handshakes and formal words that felt surreal against the memory of flying through darkness toward dying Marines. Alina left the office and walked across the base in afternoon heat, processing what had happened. She'd expected punishment and received recognition, expected isolation and found respect. The contradiction felt typically military, where outcomes mattered more than procedures when the body count was counted. Webb found her at the flight line an hour later, standing near the damaged A-10 that maintenance was slowly rebuilding. He approached without speaking, just stood beside her and watched mechanics work. The aircraft looked vulnerable on its maintenance stands, exposed and diminished without engines running and weapons loaded. "They're saying 6 weeks before she flies again," Webb said eventually. "Structural repairs and full systems check. Maybe longer if they find more damage." Alina nodded. 6 weeks felt like a different lifetime, but she'd wait. The A-10 had carried her through the valley and brought her home damaged but intact. Loyalty ran both directions between pilot and machine. She earned the rest, and the repairs. "You're famous now," Webb continued. "At least among ground forces. They're calling you the Marine pilot even though you're Air Force, saying the A-10 finally found its perfect pilot." "I'm not perfect, I got lucky." Webb laughed quietly. "Captain, I've been working A-10s for 15 years. I've seen lucky pilots and skilled pilots and crazy pilots. You're the first one I've met who's all three and smart enough to know the difference." They stood together in afternoon heat, watching the sun angle across damaged metal and scorched paint. The aircraft would fly again. Alina would fly again. And somewhere in the Helmand Valley, 12 Marines were alive to tell stories about the night an A-10 pilot dragged broken wings back toward them and made the sky remember why it learned to thunder.